Well, good afternoon. Welcome to A Reason for Hope. My name is Adrian Van Vactor, and I'm happy to be in studio with one of our pastors here at Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona, Sean Richards. How you doing, brother?
Doing very good. Enjoying the opportunity to get back in saddle.
All right. Good deal. Good deal. Well, welcome. And again, for those of you who are following on the show, this is Monday, and you know what that means. It's Apologetics Monday. And on Apologetics Monday, we laser focus on a topic, spend the whole program on it, and today's no different. We're going to continue our series on responding to atheists' claims about Christianity, sometimes to debunk Christianity or just to poke holes in the Christian story or the Christian worldview. And so today we'll be focusing on a rather emotional topic, I would say, but nonetheless a critical one, probably one of the most important areas of apologetic, presentations you could ever really hone in on. And so we will be touching on that today. But for those of you who are new, this is A Reason for Hope, a weekday Bible answer program. We just take questions from our live stream audience off the cuff. If we don't get to them, we save them. But we're here every Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Mountain Standard or Arizona time. And if you're a skeptic, if you're a believer, if you're something in between, and you just want to know, hey, what would a pastor who spends all his time studying the Bible, teaches it verse by verse, has been answering questions on the radio since 2001, what would he say about, and then fill in the blanks? And that's what we're here for. And if we don't know the answer, we'll research it. We'll take the time to go look it up. But not surprisingly, there's about 100 questions that we get all the time. It's kind of the same 100 questions. You could probably narrow it down to the same 20 questions, right, Sean? that we get all the time. But every now and then we'll get a little surprise of a question about a specific passage and something that's peculiar and thought-provoking, and want to know what our thoughts on that are. So there's really no question off the table as long as it's pertaining to the Bible, world religions, the Christian worldview, and we'll take it. And as long as it's sincere, obviously, we do take questions from people who are just trying to troll us, but that's okay. We don't mind. We'll get to the heart of the issue nonetheless. So if you want to engage with us, you can catch us on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is called A Reason for Hope. So you just go to youtube.com/@a reason4hope. You can also catch us on Facebook. Our church Facebook page is CCF Tucson or Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson. And you can also catch us on the X platform by following our senior pastor. His handle is Scott R4H. That's Scott with a double T, the letter R, the number 4, the letter H. And if you want to either DM the question, or you can post it during the live stream, or you can post it any other time, actually, and we'll get to it. If we don't get to your question, we save every question, and we have a log, and we just take them one at a time, so no question gets missed. You can also skip social media if you want, and go to our website, calvarychristianfellowship.com. Hit that Watch Live tab, and you can catch this program, all our services. We have our Wednesday evening Oasis service, our Sunday morning 9 and 11 a.m. services as well. We teach book by book, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. Right now we're going through 1 Corinthians on Sundays. We're sort of at the end of chapter 2, so we're just getting started there. You can also catch our study in Nehemiah on Wednesday evenings. And again, we just teach verse by verse, so it's a great way to study a book of the Bible. You can also go to our archives on our website. Again, that website is calvarychristianfellowship.com. Download our app in the Google or Apple Play Store and just search for CCF Tucson or Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson. Download our app and you can see all our archives. We've taught through just about every book of the Bible. So check it out. You can also email your questions. If you have a question that requires maybe a little bit of background and you want to share some data that you don't want to put on the air or put on the internet, then email us and we'll censor the critical stuff and just get to the heart of the question and help you wrestle with whatever issue that you're wrestling with from the words of the Bible. And that email address is questions@areasonforhope.org. Again, that's questions@areason4hope.org. We'll take a moment to pray and get started with today's topic.
All right. Dad, thank you for the honor you've given Adrian and I to be able to earnestly contend for the faith, to not only know the reasons we have to trust you, but to engage thoughtfully, seriously, and directly, and as much so as possible with those that would either curse and reject you or misrepresent you or simply misunderstand the witness of Christianity that's been given to them. I pray that whether it's in a spirit of correction or a series of common ground, that this would be an opportunity for many of those who are called by your name to be equipped for conversations they will have on these topics and more, that you would not only open the ears of those to receive this information that are listening, but also the hearts to be prepared for Adrian and I to not only relate this information as well, but even for the skeptics and those hostile to be challenged by this information, and for, as your word says, seeds to be planted that would ultimately bring a fruit of righteousness, that we pray for all those that are created in your image. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sean.
So,
today's topic.
Yeah, obviously, when it comes to objections to Christianity, usually from atheism, there's either going to be a misunderstanding on the part of the atheist of what Christianity means, or a long series of rabbit trails that comes from one tiny little mistake. And while some of these mistakes may seem stupid, for lack of a better term, when it comes to the objection at its core, the emotional weight that it carries with it certainly isn't diminished or left without, any need for the imagination as far as how it's impacted the lives of people. Some of the most prolific and passionate enemies of Christianity today base their rejection of Christianity off of not just a very, very sad case of projection, but also hypocrisy in a very, very important step that leads down the trail of this argument. Now, we've titled this after the atrocities of Christianity, and we want to emphasize it's more on terms of the atrocity of Christians. If you've ever taken the time, and I do recommend that you do, read Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, where he again has more criticisms for the Roman Catholic Church than anything else, but uses that piecemeal in order to criticize the entire concept of belief in God entirely, yet only one category of one denomination, of one religious group in one specific area of history. It all ultimately comes down to where this mistake goes. And this is a ray of sunshine and hope for those of you who are encountering people that either have or will bring up this objection to you, because when it comes down to it, this seems like something that requires people to have to take a college course on Christian history in order to effectively engage with, when the reality is you would only need to, as far as depth of education is concerned, take one course on basic theology in order to effectively answer every single example of the atrocities that Christians have committed over the years, insofar as an objection to belief in God. So first, let's make sure that we all understand what the argument being made is here. The argument is Christianity is false because Christianity has done evil things. I don't want to be the kind of person who does evil things, therefore I do not want to become a Christian. More along the lines of the modern attitude and sentiment of Christianity, regardless of whether or not it's true, I'm more interested as to whether or not it's bad. So since Christianity has produced nothing but bad for society, which is false, then I would want to associate with something either the opposite of it or just not associate with it on principle, because it's bad. It produces bad people. Bad things have happened in the name of Christ. Well, let's again note this as an objection against Christianity, which again is hilarious because when they are defining Christianity, they aren't basing it on the example of Jesus, but the behavior of Christians. That's their first and most deadly mistake. While they could have a point if Christianity, and this is where the issue comes in, functioned the same way as atheism, Christianity, unlike atheism, is not a self-determined and self-defined belief system. The reason for that is because we actually have a central text, a written authority, and historical definition as to where and when someone is doing it right or wrong, as far as Christianity is concerned. An atheist can't ask themselves, what would Richard Dawkins do? I'm sure one or two may have, but that's more on their opinion, not in the definition of all atheism. You can't find a single atheist that all atheists themselves must aspire to be. Therefore, if there's an atheist that did something evil, it doesn't matter, since it's a self-determined religion. No one is a better or worse atheist, they're just atheists. The amusing fact in this is that in this objection to Christianity, when they say, on the basis of how evil Christians have been in history, what they are doing is they are treating Christianity and Christians as if they are atheists, while excluding them from the benefit of a religion without any foundational and objective example. So let's break this down. The claim is that atheism is false or evil because an atheist was a fraud or an atheist committed some act of evil. We could note the Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian genocide. People were systematically targeted and exterminated on the basis of and because of the proactive beliefs of Pol Pot, who was a devout atheist. Now, the exception to this is that atheists don't speak for all of atheism. The reason for this is, again, because atheism has no founder. It's exclusively an idea or worldview about the concept of God. You can't be a bad atheist because you can't objectively claim what a good atheist is or behaves like apart from their claims about God. So notice, this is what rejects that argument. If I say Pol Pot is evil, therefore all of atheism is evil, well, you've misunderstood how atheism functions as a belief. A single atheist does not, in fact, poison the well for all of atheism, because each individual atheist does not speak for their neighbor. There may be groups that have a more, I should say, common background or theme. They would be, the more astrology-inclined atheist or the more astronomer-inclined atheist, but whether they take a more spiritist approach or a scientific approach, they would still reject the concept of God because they prefer their horoscopes or they prefer Neil deGrasse Tyson's latest Twitter post. The point, though, is this: no one's better or worse, and you can't condemn one and thus, by definition, condemn all, since there is no central text. The founder of atheism is not being deviated from because it's solely a self-determined idea, what you view God to be. We'll grant them that. Now, let's then look at this argument. Christianity is false because of the atrocities of Christians. So that's the claim, right? Christianity is false or evil because Christians were frauds and evil, just like the argument against the atheist that doesn't stick. The exception, then, is treated as if Christians do speak for all of Christianity. Now, why is that? Well, because they say Christianity has a founder. But the problem with this handling is that Christians are treated as if they are accountable to this founder as the perfect example, and at the same time not. You're a bad Christian. You're an evil Christian. Therefore, this individual Christian is and must always be the perfect example and model of Jesus Christ. Therefore, since Christianity has a founder, the atheist gets to both treat it as if it has no founder. You judge the individual behavior, not the founding documents, but then at the same time do hold that bad example as the defined and most influential example for all of Christianity. They are all held to blame as living representatives of their founding father. But the point being made in this objection and argument is that at its foundation, it is total hypocrisy. Atheists have to have no blame in this for the actions of other atheists, since they can't be compared to a founder atheist or a written standard atheists can be held accountable to. Christians can, on the other hand, be blamed for the actions of other Christians, since they are compared to their religion's founder. The problem is, have they actually provided chapter and verse of where Jesus did those things and thus speaks for all of Christianity? They take it on themselves to treat the founder of Christianity the way atheists determine their own authority, hopscotching down the way into a totally nonsensical argument, their own behavior individually, right? But was that Jesus's behavior? Well, if you're a Christian, that means that you are Jesus, correct? Well, hopefully that's, again, what we all aspire to be, but where and when we aren't, we look at our texts. The atheist doesn't look at our text. It looks at the behavior of the Christian and says, this is what speaks for all of Christianity. Let me know if you see the problem. So if you're a Christian, you're held responsible for the actions of individuals in your group. By the standard, atheists use to exempt themselves from the actions and behaviors of others in their group. What are they missing? That we, again, actually have founding documents, that they tell us what a real Christian acts like and doesn't act like. And if this is properly understood, then you can point out to the atheist, I don't care what such and such a Christian did at such and such a time. When did Jesus of Nazareth do this at his time? That's the authority for me, and that's what speaks for whether Christianity or not is good for society, if it's true or not. Because the other common feature in this is that people will always be people. The atheist will hopefully grant that point as well. And the argument still stands. There is no such thing as a good or bad atheist as long as they keep the core tenet in mind. There is no God. But the Christian also has to keep in mind the claim Jesus of Nazareth is God, the authority of Scripture, the nature of God, the nature of salvation, etc., etc. When they deviate from that, what have they done? They've stopped being a Christian. When an atheist deviates from his core beliefs and says there is a God, you can't be a deistic atheist. You cease from its core claims. But then let's ask the question, does an individual's bad example, this atheist started believing in God, therefore all atheists now believe in God? No, this Christian behaved like Jesus, therefore this speaks for actual Christianity. That's where we then get to the actual point. So what's the definition of Christianity? Hopefully this is something you're all familiar with, but we will recap. Christianity is not determined on the basis of the behavior of its followers. And by the way, if you remember that one sentence, then you can answer every single objection or example that is given regarding a historical bad example of Christianity. The term followers itself implies they are following something other than themselves. This can be an idea, a cause, or an individual, sometimes all three. And in this case, it is an individual. A Christian can be told whether or not they're doing it wrong or can disqualify themselves as an example of Christianity based on whether or not they are in line with our paragon, our ideal. It was taught directly by our founder and his followers. It was modeled historically by the primary witnesses of the major event Christianity is based on, the resurrection, and it remains the metric throughout history as to whether or not someone is, quote-unquote, like Christ. Let's get some verses so that we can actually back this up. Jesus himself speaking said in John chapter 13 and verse 13, "You call me teacher and Lord. You say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." So in this first direct example from the words of Jesus of Nazareth himself, from a primary source and in the earliest documents Christianity would have to offer, that is the Gospels, we are given Jesus outlining how Christianity functions as far as an ethical system. My example, you have seen me do these things. Blessed are you if you do those things. He gives the example of a servant and a master, a teacher and a student, then goes on to note, I'm your master, I'm your teacher. You follow my example, then you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. In this case, it was at the Passover Seder celebration where Jesus voluntarily took on the role of a servant when he was the one who should have been, in their eyes, categorically exempt from such a lowly state and responsibility, washing his disciples' feet. Now, how it was historically applied, we know that it's not just referring to, foot hygiene, but it's noting the master takes the servant's role. It's not a matter of hierarchy. But it also sets precedent for Christians in saying that Jesus is our model, and we see that from his followers as well. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, Paul the Apostle, writing to early Christians, noted that he wasn't the example or definition, even though he was a fantastic model, an ideal of what a Christian life should look like. He said, imitate me, with a qualifier, as I imitate Christ. And lastly, in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, we see the Apostle Peter, the primary eyewitness of Jesus' resurrection, say the same thing. For to this you were called, this is again 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that you should follow his steps. Quoting the Old Testament, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. Quoting again the Old Testament. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So in this definition of Christianity that is laid out for us in the actual authoritative documents, what do we see? We see all of them, not saying that this is something that, again, builds on a theme or idea. It's based off of whether or not they are in line with Christ. So did Jesus model this? Yes, you're doing it right. Did Jesus model this? No, you're doing it wrong. It's a very, very simple flow chart, like the WD-40 and duct tape principle. Does it move? Yes. Should it? No. On and on it goes. But the principle is there, and we need to make sure that this is understood. Otherwise, we'll end up just talking past each other in a way that A, doesn't matter at all to the Christian, since we understand our belief system, I hope, but also taking it a step further and noting that the atheist, when criticizing Christianity, can't both treat us as if we're atheists, individually determining what speaks for the religion, and as a whole at the same time. That's the error, that's the mistake. So let's go on to note where that source material ultimately is. We, of course, recognize it as the Bible. As mentioned before, sources from the Jewish Tanakh, or Old Testament, and the Christian New Testament are all mentioned as reasons to conclude what Christianity is and isn't. And this is the main difference between atheism and Christianity. We are accountable to a central authority. When our behavior doesn't line up with our historical example of Jesus Christ, we aren't an acceptable example of Christianity in action. When the historical example and behavior of Jesus are properly modeled, and that's again determined by the text, then you can make an assessment as to whether or not the system is moral or immoral. So we aren't condemned on the basis of someone who is doing what we're told to do. And we also aren't condemned on the basis of someone who is doing what we aren't told to do. That's a them problem, not a us problem. We don't call someone a bad Christian because we're embarrassed by them and then disassociate like atheists can and do. We call someone a bad Christian because we're comparing them to Christ, and that's the point. So let's note this in a secular example. Is there a written document of how a forklift driver should handle his machinery? If they handle it in a way that results in injury or damage to property, then who's to blame? The forklift or the forklift driver? Neither yet. The forklift is examined separate from the driver to see if there's any failures in the mechanisms, and then the driver's sobriety or behavior would be examined separately because there's two factors involved. The forklift driver being drunk doesn't make the machine defective, and the machine being defective doesn't mean the driver should be blamed. Note they both can coincide, but notice the example. Christianity isn't defective because the Christian did it wrong. And likewise, Christianity, if it's defective, doesn't mean that the individual is a bad person because they're acting in spite of it or in light of it. That needs to be determined separately. Two factors, two conditions. If both are understood, then forklift certified drivers will naturally, hopefully, resonate with a lot of you. Let's move on to a spiritual example. Is there a written document of how a let's just keep it general, religious person should behave? The answer is sometimes. If they handle that information in a way that causes those around them to be treated other than the example of what those documents describe, it is a failure on the part of the follower or the documents they are following. Again, you have to examine them separately. Perfect instance is that of Islam. In Islam's primary sources, it says in Surah 9, verses 28 through 30, to fight those who do not believe in Allah, specifically targeting Christians and Jews. Examining the historical documents based on the life of Muhammad and his original followers, Muslims living at peace today would either be a bad Muslim or is following another teaching, concealing their intentions, like Abu Bakr noted in the Hadith, where he said that we smile in the face of some people, though our hearts curse them. And again, they're waiting for when they had an army that Muhammad was, of course, explaining in History of al-Tabari in the most authoritative sources of Islam, then they would say they are a good Muslim because they're patterned after the example of Muhammad. And Muhammad is the walking Quran, according to the Quran and Hadith. If, on the other hand, the Muslim doesn't consider the life of Muhammad being relevant to being a Muslim, then they'd better hope that they live in a Christian or secular society that wouldn't have a population of Muslims in it, because those same sources would call them kufr or bid'ah, an innovator or an unbeliever. And this is the point. You can note chapter and verse, they are getting it wrong. There's Muhammad, there's not Muhammad. There's the deceptive, warmongering Muhammad, there's the peaceful modern Muslim. They are a bad Muslim because when compared to Muhammad, two different things. If they take piecemeal and say, well, Muhammad was kind to, orphans and so forth, well, then you raise your hand and say, well, then why did he abolish the concept of adoption so that, again, they would have to stay as orphans, and you can have an exchange on that. If you say, well, Muhammad stood up for women being treated unfairly, you raise your hand and say, yes, I appreciate the fact he said not to kill your daughters because they were born girls when it's more profitable to have a boy, but what about other ways he impacted the well-being of women, where it says, again, in the Quran, that you are to beat women if you even fear disobedience from them, and the conversation can continue. But notice, it's not on, does that Muslim beat his wife or not? It's what does Surah 434 say? They're an authority. They are held accountable to the text. And of course, since they're given divine permission to lie, it becomes difficult, but the point still stands. So, written document, personal example. No written document, individual example. The atheist doesn't hold themselves to a written document. Religious centers do. Forklift certified drivers do. Hopefully this is clear. Let's go in for another example. Is there a written document on how Hindus should view the world around them? Kind of. If they consider Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita, for example, authoritative for them, they would take to heart Krishna's command in the account of him talking to Prince Arunja that attachment is the only true evil. When a Hindu then, as a result, neglects the slums of Calcutta or persecutes Christian missionaries for helping the poor suffering in those slums, are they in conflict with their beliefs as Hindus? This is the key. You'd have to ask if they are committing those acts of negligence or violence out of attachment, or the teachings of Krishna or not. Because guess what? Krishna ain't the only Hindu god. And there are more Hindus that believe in other gods than exclusively that of one of the three main deities of Hinduism, Krishna, Shiva, and, of course, Brahman. But the point stands there. Do they consider, of the hundreds of millions of options available to them, Krishna as the option they choose, as one of the avatars of Vishnu, since, of course, that's the only real source we have on Hindu philosophy? Their desire to have an informed perspective on how to work out their dukkha, that's up to them. But it's not monotheistic, which again, in an atheist worldview, is totally absent as far as a factor to consider. When you look at Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, you have one God to compare yourself to and say, am I doing things his way? But that's, again, not from an informed belief either, because they would have as much in common with atheists since they have other options to choose from. Now, again, they're all still accountable to whatever teachings they choose, or they can claim to be a Buddha and found sects like Siddhartha Gautama did and claim to be the source of knowledge themselves. But once again, then you have to go For instance, if you believe the Nepalese prince is your Buddha, follow the Buddha Gartiya and hope that whatever oral traditions endured to Emperor Asoka's time did in fact line up with the words of their Lord, because we frankly don't know what they were. The point being made is this: is there then a written document on how Christians should behave? 100% yes. If they consider Jesus' example and teachings as their authority, then they should, note this, or should they, be judgmental of people's actions when Jesus said, "Judge not," in the first half of Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1? The answer is not necessarily, because it needs to be examined whether or not the second half of that sentence and the rest of the conversation is actually what's being taught. Should Christians violently drive the Canaanites out of Israel, since that's what the Bible, in fact, says? They would need to ask, A, if there are any Canaanites left on the planet, and it's not that straightforward, since those commands were written historically to Israel as a result of second chances given to a specific group of people. You'd also have to ask if that command was ever repeated or modeled by Jesus personally. And notice, that's the point. What would Jesus do? He didn't fight any Canaanites. In fact, he cast out a demon-possessed woman's daughter in order to, of course, note her as an example to the disciples that you don't have to be ethnically Hebrew to have a relationship with God, to recognize him as Lord. So this is the point. If you understand the category and argument, every single example and instance they say, this Christian was horrible, this Christian was evil, this is what Christianity has given to the world, you then ask, what did that have to do with Jesus? Where did Jesus teach that? Where did Jesus model that? An individual can be condemned, just like an individual atheist would not have bearings on how I'd treat you. But if a actual Christian lined up with Jesus, he is then, therefore, an actual Christian. And if you quote the historical sources and say, well, why aren't you following that passage, and are handling it like someone who's got the mental faculties of a monkey on a keyboard and not considering anything regarding genre, timing, or the rest of the sentence, then, of course, that's a you problem, not a me problem. But it continues on. So what are then the teachings of Christianity? If we were to sum it up, we would say it's the historical life of Jesus and the apostles' example. Christianity is treated as a true religion because its claim about Jesus of Nazareth being the Jewish Messiah. His historical teachings and example, again, are where the authentic definition of Christianity does or does not stick. If I observe Christian history, frankly, I don't see a lot of Christ, and let's just be honest. However, this doesn't make Jesus any less risen from the dead, because that's what determines its truth or not.
I just read Tyndale's martyrdom case. I was like curious as to why he was burned at the stake. Like, what did he do wrong? And all he did was translate the Bible into a readable language that the common person could read. And I thought, wait, how could any Bible reading person, the elite group, only certain people were allowed to read and study the Bible, burn someone's body because they wanted the Bible to be able to be read by the common person?
Well, the short answer would be because they were behaving more like Romans than they were Christians. But that, again, is determined based off of the trend of Romans burning people alive because they dishonored a particular god, and the Christians, who, again, are claiming to follow Jesus, even though Jesus never burned anyone at the stake or even had a problem with translating the Bible into English. In fact, he quoted the Septuagint.
I went to this castle where Martin Luther translated the Bible, and there was this well there that later Lutherans dumped the guy in because he did not believe in all the same sacraments as they did. He didn't believe that he should baptize his daughter as an infant, and so they threw him in this well for 7 years, this pit. I stood there and looked at it, and then after 7 years they pulled him out and said, "Do you now recant? Will you and believe in infant baptism?" And he goes, "No, I believe in believer's baptism." They threw him in there for another 7 years until he died. Lutherans did this.
But that's then the point. Even if they were to say Luther is a excellent insight and historical key figure, in getting Christianity back to its historical sources? Does their behavior speak for all of Christianity? It might model itself after Luther if they take his later writings a little too seriously, but it wouldn't condemn Jesus of Nazareth because, again, Luther didn't rise from the dead.
Well, that's the point, is that I find it appalling because it's so contrary to what I have studied and learned from the Bible. So, to sum up or to reiterate your point is that, as someone once said, Gandhi said, "I like their Christ, I don't like their Christian." When Christians misbehave or have committed atrocities or have committed deep, horrible, evil sin, that does not disprove Christianity any more than the fact that the 20th century saw more murders or more genocide committed at the hands of staunch atheistic, totalitarian, deeply anti-religious governments, sort of in the name of atheism, any more than that would prove atheism to be false. So when people commit atrocities in the name of some ideology, the question really is this in line with, does this logically flow from that ideology, or is it in direct conflict with, contradictory towards that philosophy? And you and I would argue that the over 100 million deaths, more than the previous 20th century of religious government murders combined.
About 8 million deaths.
Astronomically higher in one century. Not even a century, in just a few short decades. Mm-hmm. You got Mao's China, Stalin's Russia, Pol Pot's killing fields. And so if that's the case, was this the logical outworkings of atheism or the illogical outworkings of atheistic philosophies? Now, I wouldn't say that atheists did this. I would say that atheism-based dictatorships, did these things. But was it in conflict with the atheism?
Or there are other factors to consider, like politics, culture, etc.
Sure, of course there are other things to consider. There were driving forces behind it. But that worldview allowed, if there's no image-bearing mark on human beings, if there's no higher ethic to answer to, there's no judgment, then high and by in the sky when I die, so to speak. And so, but when it comes to Christians committing atrocities, then I think your point is pretty strong, Sean, and that is that these things are so appalling to us because they're so contrary to what we read in our Bibles, because Jesus taught us differently. He had mercy on evildoers. He sat and tried to minister to them, and he was condemned by the religious authorities, and obviously he condemned even religious authorities who were using their positions to lord over other people. So across the board, you see a Christ that is radically different than oftentimes, unfortunately, the Christian.
And let's ask the question as well, in those written documents, does it ever say that Christians this side of eternity, as far as what's relevant to the atheist, will be perfect? Can we be given an internal critique on a standard that A, we either don't have, or B, never claimed?
Right, yeah. Not only are we not perfect, but we're also not taught. We're also never taught to do the bad things that we've done, or do.
Yeah, and let's just read it out here. This is, I think, the most eloquent overview of Christianity's view of humanity, Christian or otherwise. This is Romans chapter 3 and verse 5. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man. Certainly not. Literally, let that not even be a thought. How then will God judge the world? For if the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I also still judged as a sinner? And why not say, let us do evil that good may come, as we are slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say? Notice, Scripture, their condemnation is just. So starting off in Paul's point, he gives two scenarios of someone who says, well, in the Christian mindset, the ends justify the means. I can lie for the greater glory of God. And what does Paul say? They are rightly condemned. He goes on to speak then. What then? Are we better than they? Not at all, for we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin. quoting the Old Testament, as it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. That's literally a word describing spoiled milk, just useless by nature. There is none who does good, no, not one. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law. Notice, Paul's speaking to believers here, those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, in light of this, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for by the law is knowledge of sin. But now the righteousness of God, his goodness, apart from the law, is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. That's referring to the Old Testament. Even the righteousness of God, through faith in Jesus Christ, to all and on all who believe. For there is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth as a propitiation, a ransom, by his blood, through faith, to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So to the atheist and for the Christians all reading, understand and listen. If the Bible makes no claim that Christians will be a perfect model of Christ, then they shouldn't be expected to. If, on the other hand, the Christian worldview is that we as sinners have been shown mercy, that implies we need it. We are guilty, and all have been condemned as guilty in the Old and New Testaments. So this is the point. If Christianity doesn't make a claim that all Christians should be perfect, then the second mistake in this conversation, the argument that Christians model Christ, therefore all of Christianity is false because this model of Christ is evil, that is also false. According to the same source, we get the definition of Christianity itself. 1 Corinthians 11:1, John 13, and 1 Peter chapter 2. But that's the point and argument. So with all this in mind, let's just do a brief overview of the history of Christianity and ask ourselves a question over and over and over again. Note, this isn't exhaustive, but in a general consensus, where and when did we see Jesus model these things? We can divvy it up in the classic Western formatting, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good as far as its relation to Christianity's inspiration and contributions that could be compared to Jesus. The bad, which was just the things that were in light of what Jesus would say happen, like, for example, persecutions and being hated without a cause. And, of course, the ugly, the fact that there are people who didn't act like Jesus in the midst of these periods of history. The first and earliest centuries of Christianity can be rightly overviewed as the Roman persecution, the reigns of Nero through Diocletian specifically, the first 3 centuries of Christian influence. The good that was contributed at this time was, again, nonviolent resistance to persecution and Caesar worship. When they protested, they didn't get violent. There were obviously some claims of riots, but those were more, again, from mixed groups of pagans and Hebrews than exclusively and inspired by Christians. We could note that during these times and seasons of persecution, there were exaggerations, but there also were common themes where the Romans themselves were boasting it. We could know on a historical basis that with multiple attestation and hostile testimony, there was a purposeful mistreatment of Christians in order to discourage or demonize their belief system. We have graffiti that notes, again, them being portrayed, or Jesus being portrayed with a donkey's head, and Christians being mocked, saying this is this individual worshiping his God. We could note the martyrdoms publicly of individuals who were heads of churches in order to intimidate their fellowships and so forth. But their nonviolence in the face of this reflects Jesus' actions. Why? Because we could note chapter and verse, Jesus didn't retaliate. Jesus didn't defend himself when he was persecuted, referencing Isaiah 52 through 53. We also note that Christianity, rarely, was ahead of the curve as far as technology was concerned through the popularization and development of codexes, that they, again, are the reason why it was more popular to put things in a book format than a scroll format, because Christians were on the move a lot, and lugging around crates of scrolls was a lot less spacious and, again, efficient than it was lugging around books that could contain more information, taking up less space. There were bad things, though, that also reflected Jesus' teachings. There were uprising and riots due to unfair treatment. The sacking of Jerusalem took place during this point in response to the Bar Kokhba revolt. We have the execution of the apostles, which, again, Jesus said would happen. There was Nero's madness in making them a scapegoat at this point, which should have been expected in the light of Jesus' teachings. You will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. There's the execution of Polycarp before Marcus Aurelius at the Colosseum events, where families were thrown to wild animals. They even had a unique term for it in Latin, which I don't know off the back of my head, but emphasizing that this was the norm. When police were called, but they couldn't, of course, verify their Roman citizenship or religious allegiance, they were neglected, and on it goes. And also note that during this time, there were people who acted contrary to Christianity. There were the Galatian heresies, which again is confronted in the book of Acts, where people were believing that Jesus couldn't be your Messiah unless you started observing Jewish rituals. They confronted that because it was contrary to the prophecies of the Old Testament and the teachings of Jesus. The Gnostic heresies, which mixed Greek philosophy, specifically the writings of Timaeus, with that as the interpretation of the Old Testament, or the New Testament, instead of just the Jewish culture that it was produced from, and responses to it like the Marcion heresies, where people tried to make a distinction between the God of the Old Testament and the New. These were contrary to Christianity because, again, they were in conflict with the founding documents. Now, again, this is where we get into the rise of heresies, or false teachings, other than Orthodox teachings. The Arian, the Roman heresies are again noted as another season of Christian history. We could note that there was good during this time period. The writings of the early church fathers gave us excellent insights into what early Christian texts were, specifically the Bible. We note as well that the creeds of Nicaea, Athanasius, and more gave us foundational beliefs to center and interpret our Bibles through. The Edict of Tolerance allowed Christians to not be persecuted on the basis of not being pagan. That is a good thing. But there were also bad things that took on at this time. There was the co-opting of Christian symbols with Roman militarization, specifically that of Constantine taking the initials of Jesus in Roman letters and noting in a dream, in this name, in this symbol, or by this sign, conquer. The translations vary, but the point does stand there. Obviously, that would be a bad thing because it was associating militaristic force instead of the actual teachings of Jesus, since Jesus himself never led an army. We also note that there were ugly things that happened when the Edict of Toleration had officially fallen through, specifically and most dramatically the execution of heretics like Priscillian. Now again, there were false teachers during the time of Jesus. Jesus never ordered their execution, yet this, again, was something they were permitted to do in dealing with things other than what Christ modeled. We could note the exiles of Hebrews that didn't believe Jesus as the Messiah, as well as other false teachers, because, again, the Bible told them to correct these individuals and drive them out of the church, not out of the state. We could note the popularization of monasticism, where people decided to live in caves separate from the common masses and evils of society, when Jesus himself did not, in fact, isolate himself and violate a very important proverb, which I also had to take to heart. There were also mass conversions of Anglo-Saxons and Germanic territories, but notice that these weren't because of the truth of Christianity. These were at the edge of the sword. Forced conversions were not in line with or modeled by Jesus Christ. The next era of Christian history can be noted as the Dark Ages. And by the way, this isn't just because it was a very dark period of history. It's referred to historically as the Dark Ages because we don't have a lot of information about what happened during this time period. Obviously, we know enough from the surrounding conquerors, but because trade in Europe had been fully cut off due to Muslims from the south Vikings from the north and Huns from the east, they were unable to survive apart from attaching themselves to the private guards, the knights of various estate owners, and these fortified estates and as castles introduced the feudalist system. But once again, none of that found in Christianity. And since, of course, there's so little information, we can't say a lot of good came out of this time period apart from people just trying to survive. There were bad things that did come out of this that were later condemned and detailed in graphically detailed for us, which was again the fusion of Roman government with Christian identity. You weren't Christian because of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. You were considered a Christian because you were European. That is not what the Bible outlines as the definition of a Christian relationship. We mentioned as well the falls of Egypt, Persia, Jerusalem, northern Africa, Spain, Asia Minor, the sacking of Rome, the closing of the Silk Road, and eventually even the fall of Constantinople, all because of the brutal nature and culture that Islam was producing. These militarized responses naturally needed to happen, otherwise Europe would have been destroyed. But they advertised these things as a means of salvation or penance because, again, the government has a role in producing a draft and organizing its citizens to its own defense. But when you put that with a Christian label on it, and as we mentioned before, that bad thing of fusing government and identity as a Christian with each other, that is not in line with Christianity. We also note that atrocities were committed, attacking of Jewish cities, which again were condemned to their credit by the Catholic bishops that were trying to sponsor and provide recruits to these attempted escorts, for lack of a better term, to repair the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The first militarized crusade was that trying to take Egypt, but once again, the ports there were not able to be effectively gained, and the crusades as a whole were outright failures. We also need to note as well that tax systems being advertised as a tithe, the persecution of Jewish communities across and beyond Europe, as well as the infamous reign of harlots, where the office of the Pontifex Maximus, the head of state in Europe, the Pope, was sold off to the highest bidder, and very, very corrupt individuals were in fact trying to and did hold those positions and offices, not in line with the claims of Jesus at all. Then we get into the Protestant Reformation. We could note good came out of that. Under the Holy Roman Empire, literacy was normalized under Charlemagne, and we note this as coming from the Jewish scriptures, that all of these things should be accessible to the average man. Evangelism spread as far as Japan and into India, which again can be noted as a positive because these societies were barbaric, and we did in fact contribute some positive things into these areas. We also need to note that the Catholic censorship that was enforced at this time of questioning church authority, the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, and the 30 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants were ugly things, not related to the cause of Jesus, but also in line with it, since of course Jesus said it should be expected that many would come in his name and would in fact wreak havoc of the church. The ugly things that came from this were counter-missionary movements like the Jesuits, who again were, for all intents and purposes, just attempting to undermine Protestants and their claims about actual Christianity in order to normalize the worship and belief of Catholic tradition. We mentioned Martin Luther earlier during this time period for questioning church tradition. Arresting someone for having beliefs in line with Scripture is not something that Jesus modeled. And we note that the mass murder of non-Protestants in territories given to them wanting to be pure Protestants is also not biblical. The iconoclast movement, where works of art were being defaced or destroyed because of a mishandling of the commandment not to make a graven image of God, but any graven image treated as blasphemous, is not, again, biblical. These, again, are just some of the things. Good things happened, bad things happened. That's just the fact of history. We could note the Inquisition and the Reconquista. The liberation of Christians and Jews from Andalusia was a good thing. The decline of Islam from India and Europe was a good thing. The mass murder of Protestants in Great Britain, Germany, and Spain was not a good thing. The mass murder of Catholics in response was also not a good thing, because Jesus was not, nor did he ever command, mass murder. We could note as well that the Orthodox pogroms in Russia, specifically targeting the Jews, the mass torture of Roman Catholic or non-Catholics, known as the Inquisitions, the terror campaigns on Protestants after again Catholics who again represented, for all intents and purposes, the last surviving vestiges of Christianity in the conquered territories of Spain, were then using the same things Muslims had been doing to them for centuries and then did them to their fellow Christians, to Protestants. This was not biblical. We could note that the rise of persecution in the reaction to these things, and most, I think, hilariously, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. I encourage you all to look that up. You need to, again, be able to have an open Bible and say chapter and verse, where does the cover-up, let me emphasize that, of a controversy regarding a Catholic and a Protestant getting married to then organize a festival on St. Bartholomew's Day to then exterminate and silence them have anything to do with the historical example of Jesus of Nazareth. Yet, nonetheless, these are considered speaking for all of Christianity when they couldn't be farther from it. Jesus never organized the mass extermination of potential political opponents under the suspicion they would be upset because Jesus was marrying somebody who wasn't, in fact, from the same type of follower of Jesus. It's completely ridiculous. Then we get into the Enlightenment. More said, in modern history, we could note the abolition of slavery, the scientific revolution, and the evangelism of the New World, the United States in particular, were all good things. We could note the fall of the British Empire and the Japanese and Catholic purges of Europe and their own homelands were not good things, but to be expected in light of what Jesus said. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. All of these must take place. We could also note that in spite of the Enlightenment, there was also the rise of antichrist cults that are still doing land office business today that claim contrary to the claims of Christ, like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the rise of communism. Then we get to the modern day, where again, we see a lot of revival, a lot of compromise, and a lot of false doctrine. We could note very good things in recent history. In the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the caliphate, of course, being removed from its influence of the world, has done a lot of good for a lot of people in and outside of Islamic lands. The refounding of the State of Israel was a phenomenal fulfillment of prophecy that not only has benefited secular Hebrews, but religious ones as well. Global evangelism through the advent of the internet is a very good thing, and we hope that it will continue even through this program. We could also note that World Wars I and II were not good events, that they cost millions of lives and were, of course, expected in all of these things. We talked about the Chinese and Russian revolutions, forced conversions, and more. Cult groups. What's the actual problem? It's people, not the claims and example of Jesus. You get that, you deal with this issue 100%. God bless you. We'll see you all tomorrow.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.